Welcome, everyone, to episode 105 of the Cardano Effect podcast. Rick and I are the hosts of the TCE podcast series. Please remember to like, comment, and share. Rick, we have a very special guest this morning. What's going on? What's happening with you? Can you introduce our guest?
Yes, we have Robert Kornacki with us on this podcast. I would like to thank Robert and welcome back to the podcast. Robert is the head of research at EMURGO and now board member at the Ergo Foundation. You've come a long way, Robert. You've been on the Cardano Effect earlier with us. And before I go on to what our podcast is about today, I'd like to give a big thanks to the Cardano Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. Thank you very much, Cardano Foundation. We appreciate your support in bringing these podcasts to the Cardano community. So let's go back over to Robert. Robert, you were on with us a long time ago, earlier podcasts, okay? And today we're getting into Oracle pools, something that people are very interested in, and a couple other subjects you'll be able to touch on with us. So welcome back to the podcast. How are you today, sir?
Thanks for having me on once again. And yeah, I think it's been a year and a half, maybe. A lot has happened, from the IOHK Summit 2019, 2020, all the craziness of this year, but everything's pretty good on my end.
Good. Yeah, we've come a long way, and thanks for your leadership and all the hard work that you've put into this project. Everyone appreciates it, right? And you do really great videos out there, and people appreciate the videos that you put out on the street. So, Philippe, what do we want to get into today? What are we here to talk about?
Let's start talking about Oracle pools. So if you're not familiar with Robert Kornacki, you can check out his Oracle pools video. It's on the EMURGO channel on YouTube. It was very informative. It was very succinct. And I think that even if you don't have a concept, if you're not extremely technical, you can understand the logic that you were pointing us towards. So if you could give us a brief summary of what Oracle pools are, we're going to start there, and then maybe we can build.
Perfect. So I guess I'll take even one step before that, and I'll explain what oracles are for some people who may not know. So with blockchains, we have a slight problem where the world is divided into on-chain and off-chain. A lot of financial data in the old financial world or other external data, maybe weather, for example, that's not inside of the blockchain, and that's outside of it. And so oracles take data from the real world and bring it into the blockchain. Why is that useful? It's useful because when we want to have certain data points, like the price of ADA in USD, for example, that's an external value that's determined by markets outside of the blockchain typically. And so if you're looking for ADA to USD, you have to take the value averaged from all of the exchanges and then post that onto the blockchain. For especially a lot of DeFi, which is probably the number one use case of oracles today, Oracle data is vital because without it, you can't do a lot of things like stable coins and so on forth. So now that we understand what oracles are, what are Oracle pools? The use case of oracles for DeFi are typically data feeds. And so every 30 minutes, hour, 2, 3, 4 hours, a new price point, a new data point, say ADA USD, is posted on chain. And this is updated every 4 hours, for example. These data feeds are vital. And so what we want to do is guarantee that they're accurate. With oracles, you always have the problem is that you have some trust. Someone has to take the data from the outside world and put it on the blockchain. And that trust is a problem because when you have DeFi dApps worth $1 billion, $500 million, however much, which a lot of DeFi dApps are getting very, very, very heavy in liquidity these days, we need to make sure that we don't just trust one man who can be bought off and then suddenly, whoops, that 500 million in that dApp now all got liquidated because someone said the price of ADA is 1/5 of a cent, right? And so Oracle pools are an attempt to look at existing models that are out there, try to make them less focused on centralized figures, make them more decentralized, and have kind of a base framework where you can add incentives, disincentives, consensus, and all these pieces, I guess you could say, which allow us to have a higher level of assurance. And so at a very high level, I guess that's what you would say an Oracle pool is for.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. I have a question. You mentioned outliers, and you mentioned it in your video as well, as far as when we're talking about DeFi apps, and let's say we're sourcing the price of ADA. We'll just use ADA to USD as an example. You have multiple different data points across different exchanges. Coinbase may be reporting this price. Binance may be doing this one. Bittrex may be doing this one. Cryptocurrency itself, or blockchain itself, or cryptocurrency, it's a very nascent industry. So there are the chances of a lot of outliers. I mean, especially when you move from the main tier of exchanges or price information to the smaller unknown exchanges, and there are various different exchanges running in smaller countries, and they don't have the liquidity that Binance or Bittrex has. So price fluctuation is a lot greater. So ADA may be trading for 2x or 3x the value in a sort of bull run because there's just not as much available, or vice versa. There just may be a tenth of the costs on an exchange for a fraction of a period of time. So if that data point gets snapshotted at that particular time, it's seen as an outlier. So how do you determine what an outlier is, and what can be done to make sure that the data is fair, not necessarily if that outlier is a bad actor, but just does not have the accurate information at that particular time?
Right. So I guess one way for people to think about this, to make it simple to understand, in an oracle pool, you essentially have a bunch of oracles working together to source a single data point. And so time is divided into epochs. So you could say in slots or blocks. So for example, every hour. And everyone posts their data point. And so your question specifically right now is, how do you source a data point from all of these different sources to post onto the blockchain that's actually accurate, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a few ways to go about this. And so you could take a more centralized approach and say only trust Coinbase because they have a signed data feed, for example, and they have high liquidity. And some people choose to go that route. But there's also problems there. You're very centralized, trusting one company, and also it's very limiting because there's not all that many data points that are signed and have that kind of trust. In terms of having these very low liquidity exchanges, what's a pretty simple way to go about this, and what's done with oracle pools, is that we have this concept of connectors. And connectors are a piece of software that run in between the oracle pools themselves, which to be a little bit pedantic, oracles run a piece of software called the oracle core. This is what creates the transactions and posts the data on chain. Besides the oracle core, we have oracle core connectors. These are connectors which source the data from the real world and submit it to the oracle core, which then creates the transactions to post on chain. That said, what we have in oracle pools is that we have these connectors, and these connectors are programmable so that we can actually be very specific in how we want our data points to be sourced, how they're averaged, how they're weighted. And so when you, for example, have a low liquidity exchange that might have 10K USD per day volume, well, then you can measure the weight of that data point by its volume. And so if you have a very trusted high volume exchange, say Binance, etc., KuCoin, Bittrex, well, you can weight those much higher based on their volume and also based on their general trust level. And so, we can use quantitative metrics, but also some qualitative metrics that maybe, we don't see that, Binance or Bittrex or KuCoin are the best exchange, but they're reasonably trusted compared to, say, some exchanges which may have exit scammed before. And you can weight based on the quantitative numbers, say volume, but also on these more qualitative aspects, which maybe the oracle pool, oracles within an oracle pool all decide that they really trust Binance, KuCoin, and Bittrex, but they don't trust 3 other exchanges because they've looked at the history and then the charts have been very varied because there's wash trading, for example. The cool thing about oracle pools is that rather than like in some other projects like Chainlink, where oracles are just individuals and they don't have a grouping, really. The base in Chainlink is a single oracle. And so effectively, they act like thugs that you hire or mercenaries. And so because you don't have this agreed upon group of people who all keep each other in check, who all source the exact same data point, who all use the same connector, and who all agree to come together and then have a reputation at stake, kind of like stake pools in Cardano. This reputation factor is pretty big. And so it adds a lot of incentives, besides also monetary incentives on chain, for making sure that the actual source data point via the connector and the logic, which does all the weighting, is actually valid. Because if it's not good and it's a terrible quality data point, it's constantly going up and down 500%, well, then they're also not going to get any funding because no one's going to be using their Oracle pool. And so essentially, Oracle pools, I think as I mentioned previously, are a solid base framework with a lot of potential to build on top of in incentives, disincentives, consensus, and more, which works on the reputation between the oracles within the pool to then give more assurance to the end users in their dApps.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So you mentioned Chainlink, and they have this sort of one data point, one entry type of system. So the Oracle pools and necessary, like you're using the power of statistics to your advantage. The more data points you have, the greater accuracy you're going to have with those points, even with outliers. And over a long period of time, it's going to be a more reliable source of information, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yes. With Chainlink, they do have aggregation as well, but they're essentially accumulation smart contracts. And so how it works on a high level is that they're just individual oracles, typically also very trusted and centralized oracles. So, a really big company that runs some sort of dApp or, a hedge fund, et cetera, and they run these oracles because they're considered high trust. And hopefully they don't cheat and, take your money or screw your dApp up. And so all that the accumulation contracts do is call each oracle, gets their data point, and then averages them out. However, this isn't very high assurance to some degree. Every oracle is just an individual actor. They have some incentives where they get paid a small amount. But as we saw, I'm not sure if you guys seen, recently, the gas fees in Ethereum made the cost so high for oracles that posting a data point cost an oracle money because the payment wasn't enough. And so they actually got drained of a lot of funds because people just spam attack them. And so you have a lot of these individual factors running with Chainlink because it's a very big system and it's trying to do a lot of things all at once. Yet, at least in my opinion, they don't have a lot of the key basic groundwork. So they don't actually have disincentives. So if you have this accumulation contract and the accumulation contract pays out an oracle, if that oracle doesn't post their data point in, say, the next 5 blocks, they have no repercussions. They got the money, they didn't post it, and they'll have some reputation damages, but there's nothing at stake, right? But with oracle pools, in a future version, we already have the informal specification built out for all the logic, so we know it's possible and it's going to work. We just haven't implemented it yet because timelines, there's a lot to do. But with oracle pools, we're going to have stake slashing. And so that means an oracle has to put down, $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, however much money as collateral. And if they fail to do their job, that gets slashed. And so you're essentially creating a stronger guarantee that they actually do their job. And they're not just going to leave, their oracle running on an AWS instance and check once a month. They're going to check multiple times a day, have a bunch of notifications, and make sure they're on top of having that run, or else they lose a ton of money. This is a super simple thing to some degree. Like, I think most of us could realize that, hey, that's a good idea. If someone fails to do their job as an oracle, well, they should have repercussions. However, in existing oracle systems, specifically Chainlink, like we're talking about right now, that's not really implemented. And it's only something they've talked about for a while. I've seen comments from back in 2018 and 19, I think. They said it's on the horizon. But, we're nearing the end of 2020 and it's not implemented. And, it begs the question, what are the main focuses of existing systems if they don't have such, in some regard, basic features? And so Oracle pools try to take these oracles that are a key part of smart contract infrastructure and reframe them into the UTXO model, and then put them in a reference of epics, and then build out from that base a lot more on top. With your question about outliers, one of the next upgrades which we're going to be making is the idea of consensus also. So as many of you know, you have an idea of consensus on blockchain. And in an Oracle pool, what we can also have is a consensus of the accuracy of a data point. So we can make it so that if there's, let's say, 10 oracles in an Oracle pool, and we want 50% consensus, so that at least 50% of the oracles must agree that a data point is within a specific range in order for the Oracle pool to update at the end of the epoch. This means that we have a much stronger guarantee that we're not just going to have 2 or 3 oracles go rogue, because if we just use basic averaging, even if we have 10 oracles, 7 are good actors and they post valid data points, but then we have 3 oracles that go rogue, those 3, if they put a very low data points, you can still go minus 50% because that's how averaging works. With consensus, you can stop that entirely, where you have to have at least 5 people, for example, agree to be, let's say, 0.5% within each other. So that's your range. And so then even if you have, let's say in our example, 4 people who are all bad actors, they're all scheming, they're all paid off, and they're all trying to crash the Oracle so that 10 dApps all crash. With this consensus mechanism, using deviation checking, we can guarantee that that won't happen. And what's more, sorry if I'm rambling here, I'll finish off in a moment.
Please keep going.
Thanks. So what's more is that when we have stake slashing put together with deviation checking, we actually have something new. Why is that? So with deviation checking, we have this idea of consensus. So we have to have at least 5 out of 10 oracles which need to collude if they were to attack the Oracle pool, because we have 50% consensus. With stake slashing, we also have an amount of collateral which every Oracle must submit. What this means is that we actually have a monetary number, a quantitative number, about how much money it would cost to pay off all the oracles to get them to falsify their data in a very simple manner. Because all you have to do is say your consensus is 5 out of 10, and say each one has to submit $10,000. Then you have to do simple math of 5 oracles times $10,000. And so then the cost of corruption of your Oracle pool is $50,000. Admittedly, there's also a lot of reputation at stake. And so that's kind of a naive calculation. That's like, if you just want hard numbers, that's the lowest cost of corruption of your Oracle pool. So if you have a bunch of people who, they're not anonymous, who are running oracles, then, let's say us 3 are running an Oracle pool. We have a lot of reputation in the community, and it's not just going to cost us our 10K plus $100 or something to buy us out. That's not going to be reality. It's probably not going to be double, triple, maybe it's going to be billions of dollars, or, if we're more ethical people, we can't be bought out. And so both on a, quantitative game theoretic standpoint, where we're just assuming everyone's a full profit motive actor who doesn't care about ethics or anything, we can already start to model the cost of corruption of Oracle pools in the worst case. And then this gives us a lot better assurance so that we can have dApps that actually rely on Oracle pools. And this is something that's quite interesting and exciting, in my opinion.
Wow, this has been amazing so far, Robert. I really appreciate it. I'm always curious about the functional block diagram of how things are connected together. So you described you have these Oracle connectors that sit out there it's a piece of software that can run on the exchange and monitor the value of various coins to USDT, Euro, Yen conversion rates, and then report periodically back to the Oracle. So I know where the connector resides. Where would the Oracle pools actually reside? Would they sit like on a block producer, a relay, any server that someone might want to run? Is it dependent on a running on a pool relay or block producer, something like that? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Good question. So overall, there's three parts to this. You have the on-chain. So, you have your UTXO-based blockchain, whether that's Cardano or Ergo. And so you have UTXOs on the blockchain. And that's where the Oracle pool itself lives, because that's kind of the state of the Oracle pool. We need to submit data from the real world to the blockchain. And so we submit data into the Oracle pool itself, which then other dApps and other smart contracts can reference. The Oracle core, which is the software that runs the Oracle, that posts to the Oracle pool on-chain, that is run by each Oracle owner. And so that has to be online the full time. And it also needs access to a wallet. So you need a full node wallet plus the Oracle core, because you need to submit transactions. And so you need access to the wallet because you need to pay transaction fees, and then you need access to the network. And so the wallet acts as that middleman between the on-chain Oracle pool and then the off-chain world, the Oracle core. The Oracle connector, lastly, is also run by each operator, and it only pings the exchanges. So it doesn't live on the exchange, but it just asks them, hey, what's this price? Hey, what's that price? Hey, what's this price? And then it averages them all together, weights them, etc.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. Appreciate it. Thank you. Philippe?
As far as, so for example, if you're trying to get that consensus, that 50% consensus, or whatever the system, whatever it's determined, how is that determined? Is that a governance-based issue? Like, who determines that we need 60 or 40% or 70% of the nodes reporting within a tenth of a percent or hundredth of a percent accuracy? Is that a governance thing that people vote for, or?
So in the initial implementation, because there's a lot of moving parts to this, so we have to go one step at a time. And so whether we have governance or not, these parameters are always set by the people who create the Oracle pool in the first place. Because you always have to start somewhere. And even if you have governance in place, you need to put the Oracle pool on chain. You need to instantiate it. And so at some point, you kind of have to decide, even if you have governance, okay, for the first 5 epochs, we're going to do X, Y, Z. And so what this means is that in the current Oracle pools in the implementation right now, in the smart contracts, all of these are hard-coded into the smart contract. So everyone who is in a pool gets together and they just discuss off-chain. However, everybody, you have your addresses and you discuss, okay, we should have this parameter, that parameter, should have this minimum collateral, this deviation check, this amount of consensus minimum percentage. And then that gets posted on chain, and that is your parameters for your Oracle pool. Right now, we at EMURGO, together with the Ergo Foundation, are researching into update mechanisms for UTXO-based smart contracts and dApps. This is slightly more complicated than in the account-based model, but there's also more options and more flexibility. And so what our intention is eventually to have our Oracle pools where you have your parameters set. And then we have 2 paths essentially. Implement governance directly in the Oracle pool itself, or implement governance as a second layer in the smart contracts where they can update the contracts. And so even though the parameters are hard-coded, you can update the smart contract, which has the hard-coded parameters, to a new smart contract. And so effectively, initially, the people part of an Oracle pool decide what the parameters are. But then eventually, with these update and governance mechanisms, you'll either have the people running the Oracle pool deciding on these parameters, or if you have an external governance, say, you distribute governance tokens to all holders of ADA or all holders of ERG. And so, you have a very decentralized governance, which is also possible. Then those people who have governance tokens can update those parameters. And so there's a lot of flexibility, which is what I and some of us behind Oracle pools, because I got some help from Amitabh, who is the cryptographer behind Ergo. And one of the things we really wanted to do with Oracle pools is have a strong base framework, but then have a lot of options for what you can do on top. And so we can kind of explore what is possible.
Okay. This is fascinating. I have a follow-up question, because one of my gripes or one of my issues with Cardano in general is the lack of privacy features. So when you're running these sort of these Oracle pools, or you decide to run an Oracle, and let's say use your example that you used before, us three run an Oracle pool. We make YouTube videos where people know our faces, this and that, and as the price or the collateral for certain Oracle projects increases, if cryptocurrency hits this moonshot one day, then you could be talking about 5 figures, 6 figures, or 7 figures of collateral in order to validate certain pricing claims over a given period of time. So is there a way to run privacy solutions on these oracles, like putting them through like SGX or these certain enclaves, and not necessarily tying a particular identity to an oracle?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because it's inherently a trade-off, right? Where if you have only anonymous people, and let's say using enclaves or not using enclaves, you have a problem of knowing that they're actually different people. So this is a Sybil attack problem, essentially, where sure, you can have a Oracle pool of 100 unique people, but unless you know who they are they really unique? Maybe yes, maybe no. And so that's why with Oracle pools, one of the ideas is that people can choose to coordinate and come together and run their own Oracle pools so that maybe they're, like us, more well-known, more trusted. So maybe the collateral we require is a bit less because people know we have our reputations at stake. And so there's a different trade-off there. And that's a trade-off some people would like to make. We're already public, probably doesn't hurt us too much. But other people, maybe they have certain circumstances where they can't be public, or who knows what. They respect their privacy and they don't want to share that. And so then they'll probably need more collateral. But as you mentioned, there are options like these enclaves. And those are interesting. But I don't know if many of you have kept up to date in the audience, or either you, Rick, or Philippe. A lot of these enclaves, they're pretty secure, but they keep being broken into not that many years ahead. And so if your assurance is based off of a piece of hardware that A, often isn't open source, so you don't really know what's going on there, B, isn't easily reproducible, and C, has kind of a history of being attacked or hacked and exploited, it brings up a question of, is that a really good approach to take? Especially once these oracles have, let's say, billions of dollars on the line. Hiring a security expert team to then hack into the chip so that your oracle can be exploited, and even though it ran through the enclave, now it's just arbitrary data being fed in because there's billions of dollars and someone paid you, 500 million or something. Well, that's a really hard problem to solve, because these enclaves then become your 100% trust assumption. And at least in my opinion, from everything I've seen, I wouldn't want to trust everything on these enclaves and assume they're this godsend, this panacea that just solves everything. Maybe one day we'll get there, but I think if there's one thing that we've seen with cryptography over the years, or any sort of technology, if there's enough effort and money, or if there's enough money put as an incentive for you to break something or find some way around it, pretty much everything on Earth is hackable. You may make it very hard to hack. It may cost someone hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, or, with Bitcoin, if you want to destroy the blockchain and rearrange stuff, it may take millions and millions and millions of dollars over consecutive hours, but it's still possible. And to make something that's perfectly secure, I don't actually think that's not feasible. And historically, we've seen it's not feasible. And so, yes, these enclaves could be a really great option too for Oracle pools, especially if someone wants to remain anonymous. But also, I would, stay away from expecting this to just be the one solution. It works for everything. Everyone has to do it. I think it's a great option, but we have to weigh out the risks as well.
Understood. I want to shift quickly. Before we shift quickly, so let's go back to Chainlink. From what I understand, in order to run certain oracles, you actually have to use the native token link in order to purchase these contracts or whatever you need to run your oracle. Or so when we're referring to UTXO based blockchains like Ergo and Cardano, will they have to also use the native token in order to participate in being an oracle?
Right. Just to clarify slightly, Link is not the native token of Ethereum. It's just their creative token. The native token of Cardano is ADA, and the native token of Ergo is ERG.
Yes.
So that out of the way. Yes, one of the issues inherently with Chainlink, from a usability standpoint, and some would argue it's a great issue, so to speak, because it's making people a lot of money. But in practical terms, the use case of the Link token isn't very great. There's no reason really why you need to use Link where you could just use the native token like ERGs or ADA as collateral if that's used in your system. The great thing about Oracle pools, and one really cool thing about UTXO-based systems, is that we have this concept of UTXO, an unspent transaction output. And so when you send a transaction, you destroy an old UTXO and you create a new output, a new UTXO. What this also means is that when you destroy an old one, you don't just have to create one new UTXO, you can create 1,000. Generally, people don't do that because they have no use case and it's a lot of dust. But you have the ability to choose how many outputs you create. In Ethereum, this is impossible. You just send money to someone from one account to another. So why am I talking about this? When you have these arbitrary tokens like Link, they're kind of limiting because at some point in the chain, someone has to purchase Link, someone has to send it to someone else, and it's not a very useful token, as in not 26 projects are using it, and it can be used for this, that, and next. It's just Chainlink, and if we're being realistic about it, it's kind of just a barrier to entry, and it makes things harder. Since with Oracle pools, we're using the native token on the blockchain, so ERG or ADA, what this means is that we have a lot easier of a way to generate funding for these Oracle pools. Why? Because when you have a dApp, and say your dApp is a stablecoin, for example, and let's say you want to mint some stablecoin. When you mint that stablecoin, you require data from the Oracle pool to check that the exchange rate is, value X, and so your conversion of your native currency to stablecoin is at a specific rate. When you're doing that, you're using the Oracle pool. And so what we can do now on the UTXO system that wasn't possible on the account model is that since I'm submitting ERGs, or say I'm submitting ADA into the stablecoin dApp, I can also take a small percentage of those ERGs or ADA and send it to the Oracle pool. And so in one transaction, I'm both using the stablecoin dApp, but also funding the Oracle pool. And so in this way, you have a much simpler method where big dApps can start to fund key Oracle pools within the ecosystem. So let's say ADA USD for Cardano, ERG USD for Ergo, and also the other respective cryptocurrencies value too. And you can have these DeFi dApps and other dApps that are very popular fund these Oracle pools. And then because they're funded by these big dApps, it's effectively like the smallest tax that almost no one feels, yet you have this constant oracle data being produced. And what's cool about the UTXO model further is you have this concept of data inputs. And so once the data is generated, anyone on the entire blockchain can reference that oracle pool for free. And so we're kind of changing up how things are working, where you're not paying in some arbitrary token that the protocol decided was necessary. You're just running on the native token of the blockchain. And because of this, you have a much smoother ability to fund the oracle pools and a much easier ability for other people to read the data, which is kind of like a public good almost, because it's funded by these really big core infrastructure dApps that run on your blockchain.
You think that would be more cost effective by doing that? UTXO, you're paying for the cost of the transaction and paying the oracle pool at the same time, and you won't have these bloated costs like we have seen happen with Ethereum recently.
Definitely. Yeah. So creating an extra output with your transaction is simpler computationally compared to sending funds to one address and then having smart contract logic, which says, okay, do XYZ and send funds to another place too. And so because UTXOs in some way are a much more distributed form of state and how transactions cause state changes. So it does actually mean that even when these blockchains get a lot more bloated, there's tons and tons of use cases and dApps running nonstop. The ability to send, not even just to an oracle pool. Theoretically, you could send to some sort of foundation, maybe a crowd fund, and do 6 or 7 different send to 6 or 7 different places and make 6 or 7 different contributions to various dApps and other such things, but with one transaction. And so you can have a lot of scaling benefits in that as well.
That's good to know. I have an abstract question about oracle pools. If you go to the Ergo website, you have 2 oracle pools running, the ERG to USD and ADA to USD. And we talked about price a lot. So I want to try to transition to the real world to see exactly what information we could pull from real world companies that could be used in blockchain oracles. Like I immediately think about like commodity trading and like, for example, the price of oil or the price of certain produce, the price of just anything that's being traded in general. I know that there's a lot of control from these centralized companies and there's a lot of manipulation, especially when you think about oil, like in the Middle East, they set the prices and it is what it is. Or if you're talking about like avocado production in Mexico or something like that, there are the cartels that are telling you that this is the price that you're going to sell it and this and that. So how do we get to a point where we can make real world more decentralized, especially if, there are cartels in every single industry basically controlling the price? Would they ever feel comfortable submitting price? What would be the incentive for them to act in a more honest way and work with blockchain projects?
Right. So this is an interesting question because it kind of works on multiple levels. And I can give you a slight example of a use case that could be helpful. So in regards to sourcing weather data, I spoke with a certain startup not too long ago called Arbol. And a lot of the data sets that are being sourced for weather data are now starting to become more decentralized as it becomes cheaper to kind of create that data or record that data. And in our current world, the only people who really source these numbers for weather data or price of oil and other such things are these really big centralized entities because they have the incentive to do so. They have an API, which they sell off to other companies. They directly work with exchanges, yada, yada, yada. And so for them, they have all the incentive and everything to gain, but smaller people or even medium-sized companies don't really have that incentive. And so as we start to move into a more decentralized future, weather is kind of a good example for this, where it's becoming more and more likely for people to purchase equipment to start to record the weather. And so we can have a decentralizing effect where it's not just these really big companies that do all the measuring, but if we know, for example, the majority of those centralized companies are rigged or somehow they don't produce good data, we ourselves, as the technology becomes cheaper, can start to source this data. And so I think now that we're getting to a point where there's actual incentives for such things, because we want oracles that are trusted. And so maybe we want a data set that's from 150 different people all in one localized region, and they all are, let's say, KYC'd, and you know exactly who they are, and you have this more bottom-up approach, which is very decentralized. Then it becomes very interesting in how we can start to source all of these data points, not just from the top down, but also from the bottom up. And so there's always going to be manipulation, and especially, you know, with oil, that's, you know, us compared to the oil industry, that's an impossible beast to fight. If they, you know, manipulate price, there's just no way around that. And so there is a question, right? Like, technically, if oil prices are rigged, is it safe to use those oil prices for on-chain smart contracts? Maybe they can rig them some more, and if there's eventually millions or billions of dollars on the line, maybe it'll be beneficial for them, and it'll make sense for them to rig it and then just crash your smart contracts and dApps and make that crypto. It's possible. But that's something that's effectively, how do you determine the truth, right? Yeah. And then we're getting to like, you know, we can solve some things with technology. We don't have magic wands where we can just, you know, decipher what is the actual true market rate, assuming we had a full free market and there was no intervention and yada, yada, yada. And so I think it's an unsatisfactory response, but to some degree, we can't have 100% assurance. There's always going to be some people which you have to trust, and maybe that's a gigantic billion, trillion dollar company or set of companies. But effectively, at some point, someone has to source the data. We're all human. We all have, you know, the potential to lie, the potential to be bought out. And so there's always risks involved. But I think our goal is to minimize the risks and also develop the technology so that if we only have all these centralized actors and we decide ourselves that we can't trust them, we have the ability to also create alternate systems, source our own data, create our own oracle pools, you know, start from the bottom up. And even if the majority of people are fine with using these centralized actors, there's also alternatives for those people who don't trust them and who can actually start building their own infrastructure. And so I think that's, in my opinion, a much more important goal rather than trying to solve all of the world's problems, which we can't, but instead to build the technology so that when we see clear failures, we have the ability to, you know, go left when they're going right and try to actually build something that works for us and actually provides, you know, a better alternative than what's available.
Fascinating. I think that was a perfect response. What do you think, Rick? I mean, this idea, I mean, what I'm getting from this is that there are certain industries that we're going to be able to transform more than other industries. That weather example was perfect. I mean, it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to have equipment. You know, I mean, you could run an app on your phone and maybe it has another sensor, an additional sensor to input more data. So cheaper technology is going to allow for more decentralization, but certain industries, they're never going to be fully decentralized. I don't know. Did you have anything to say, Rick, about that?
Yeah, I don't know. I was just curious about all this data. It's a massive amount of information that you could potentially collect. Is it very small pieces? You only got to get a tiny bit of data to put on chain? I'd imagine, or I would hope it would be. I know I used to run an Ethereum full node, and it would take, I got up in about the 600 gigabyte range before I deleted it. So I'm assuming it takes very small amounts of data.
Yes. I'll answer your question in two parts.
Do you guys test that kind of stuff? Do you figure out, hey, how much data is this going to take? How do we get it as small as possible? So we put this on chain. it doesn't become massive bloated terabytes of data, right? I'm assuming you guys model that and figure it out.
For all Oracle data, effectively, we go for minimizing everything to as small as possible. And so you always kind of play a balance of, okay, what is not enough data and what is just enough data. So, you could post a data point every 5 minutes. You could post a data point every 10 weeks. You have to find a perfect balance for your use case because, if the price of, let's say, gold, oil, etc., changes a lot, well, then you might want to have it every hour, every 30 minutes. And, that does have some blockchain bloat associated with it. However, one of the cool things that we can say is that for both Cardano and Ergo, we have some interesting solutions to some of the blockchain bloat problem too. In Cardano, for example, the smart contracts don't actually live on chain. They're actually off chain and only the hash of the contract is on chain. That helps to collapse a lot of the bloats and makes a bit of a difference. In Ergo, what's also really interesting is the concept of storage rent. And so because we have UTXOs and not accounts, UTXOs are destroyed and created. And so Ergo is kind of experimenting with one of the first attempts at something like this to solve blockchain bloat entirely. It's the first blockchain to try this, where you have the idea of storage rent and garbage collection. So if your UTXO exists for 4 years, miners can re-spend your UTXO and changing no data, no contract, but only taking a very small fee. And in that way, essentially, they're rewarded for storing the data on the blockchain. Then, if your UTXO runs out of funds, it gets completely deleted and it's just completely removed. So in this way, very old coins, let's say they get lost, like let's say Satoshi's coins on Bitcoin, they're actually brought back into circulation and they fund the miners. And so you kind of have this way of destroying the old history that's useless, bringing back coins into circulation that are lost forever, and removing a lot of blockchain bloat. And so both Cardano and Ergo, using the UTXO model, are trying two different approaches, which also work in tandem. And it's kind of interesting to see how this next generation of extended UTXO blockchains are trying to solve a lot of these issues that we've seen in the past with the likes of Ethereum.
Interesting. Very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about Ergo. So you are the new board member for the Ergo Foundation. And I saw it on Twitter from a couple of people. People want ERG support in Yoroi. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Ergo is working on? Maybe when that ERG support will come in Yoroi, or give us some sort of timeline, or I don't know.
So for those who don't know, Ergo is a proof of work blockchain that is actually the very first blockchain to release with the extended UTXO model for smart contracts. And so it launched in July 2019, and it's been really the test bed to see what is possible in this new model. How does it work? While also trying a lot of other cool, neat features, like I mentioned, with storage rent and garbage collection. With Ergo right now, it's a very nascent and very bootstrapped community, where it's kind of like the early days of Bitcoin, where there's a lot of new tech, a lot of people are excited, but there's also 64 different ways we could go, because there's this new innovation, this new innovation, this new innovation. And so it's a very exciting time where if you're technical, you like the UTXO model, you want to jump into a whole new industry that's about to really expand and grow, especially as Cardano moves into Goguen. Now is a really great time to find out how the UTXO model works for smart contracts. For Ergo, from the inception, we've had a lot of really cool step-by-step discoveries and also a lot of cool tech. For example, because the UTXO model is more functional in nature, we actually have some formal verification libraries already supported for ErgoScript, the smart contract language for Ergo. And so 3 months after launch, as the launch was in July 2019, we already had a crowdfunding smart contract that worked on chain, and we used it to actually run a crowdfund. And then we formally verified it that it's actually secure. And so that was really cool and an awesome innovation to see that this change in model and the simplicity, because the smart contracts, for the more technically inclined people out there, are not Turing complete in the UTXO model. So you don't have things such as infinite loops, but they're Turing complete across multiple transactions. And because of that, you lose, let's say, 3% of power by not having Turing complete smart contracts in one transaction. But then you gain a lot of simplicity, which allows you to formally verify everything a lot easier. And so that's a trade-off that's, in my opinion, and I think in the majority of people who are honest and look at it, very, very worth it. Because you get this really new upgrade in tooling and security because you have formal verification. In terms of what Ergo is actually doing and what's really cool and novel, Ergo also has what's called Sigma protocols, which are similar to Schnorr signatures, if some of you have heard of that. And so in Ergo, all smart contracts have privacy preserving features. And so you can kind of create ring signatures, like you might know in Monero, just by saying that in the smart contract, either I can spend the UTXO, either Rick can spend the UTXO, or Philippe can spend the UTXO. If we have a contract that's literally one line, just 3 conditions, either I can, Rick can, or Philippe can, so it's like 25 characters just typed, then when that UTXO gets spent, nobody knows which 3 of us spent it. And so it's really cool because you have this super expressive model of smart contracts on the UTXO system with privacy built in and for really cheap. That transaction that would spend that ring signature would cost us right now like 3 cents or something. While you have big privacy preserving coins that cost, maybe 50 cents, $1, $2, and they don't have smart contracts. So what's really exciting here is that we have very cheap privacy preserving features embedded directly into the smart contracts. And that was one of the things that got me really excited about Ergo. And that's really one of the first of its kind. And so this is also one of the things that the differences between Ergo and Cardano. There's different facets: proof of work, proof of stake, garbage collection, privacy preserving, Sigma protocols. There's a lot of these facets that are different. But then over time, we're looking to build out the bridges between the two systems so that we can have the benefits of both and maybe have some more privacy preserving stuff on Ergo, but then also have a lot of cool governance related stuff, proof of stake related stuff on Cardano, and maybe get the best of both worlds by building out this interoperability. And so as you asked with Yoroi, what's some of the next steps? What we want to do with Yoroi is have a really strong wallet for specifically extended UTXO based blockchains. So that right now is Cardano and upcoming is Ergo. With the Ergo support, that's going to be coming. Don't hold me to this. A lot of stuff, timelines are always fluctuating, but you can give it within the start of Q4, probably around there. So coming up not too far in the near future.
I want to caveat that since you
Yes.
put a date on that. What Robert just did is he gave us an estimate. Okay. I'm going to emphasize it was a guess. I don't want anyone coming back on the Cardano effect and saying, you promised, right? Because that's what happens. And people, they say, Robert promised. No. It was a guess. It's kind of like a rough estimate, right? Yeah. So that's good. I'm glad you said that. But I do want to say, Robert, you enlightened me on some stuff here. I was wondering, I was installing Yoroi just a few weeks ago. I was putting in the newest version to make a video. And I noticed that when it said select currency, and I'm hitting, wait a second, why is it asking me to select currency? What are they up to at EMURGO that, and it gives you the option to select Cardano. And I knew right there, I was like, what are they doing? Because they're going to there's going to be more currencies inside Yoroi. So now everybody knows why. If you've installed Yoroi since the mainnet and the Shelley releases of Yoroi, you'll notice it says select currency. Well, now we know the answer to that question. And you're answering my questions before I can even ask them. I was wondering what are the parallels between. No, I'm glad you do that, Robert. You're really good at that. You're really good at explaining things. The parallels between Ergo and Cardano, and how do they converge? Like if Ergo does some Oracle work and produces some data, how does that data get to the Cardano blockchain? Is there some kind of bridge, or because they're both UTXO, it's relatively transparent? It can just be. How does that work?
So that's a pretty big question, actually.
All right. Okay. Give me the short version. Talk to me like we're 12. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. How's it work?
Yeah. So there are a lot of questions here because these days there's a lot of protocols coming out in Ethereum and other blockchains for how do you have interoperability. IOHK, IOG did research into NEPO POWs. There's a lot of things which we're looking at, how to make that happen, to have the interoperability between smart contracts. But one of the things which we're going to do with Yoroi that I think is going to be interesting for people is we're looking at having the two ecosystems almost meld together when you use Yoroi. Because we're going to have Yoroi, as some of you may know, we're going to be slowly moving towards having smart contract capabilities, especially as Goguen gets into its final stages of release. So right now, we're really fine-tuning a lot of the key factors that are required for having web-based dApps on Yoroi for the UTXO model. And that's what we're building out first on Ergo. And then eventually, we're going to be doing the same thing once Goguen releases for Plutus. And so maybe in the beginning, we're not going to have this perfect interoperability where you can just move tokens seamlessly from one chain to the other, because that's a bit of a big problem. There's a lot of moving parts in between. But we intend to make the experience for users as great as possible so that when someone's using Yoroi, whether they're on Ergo or on Cardano, they still get a really great experience. And then eventually we'll have great interoperability and maybe even have projects on both systems that work essentially the same, and you can just switch between the two.
Okay. Wow, I'm glad to hear there's a plan. Nice. Philippe, that's all I got, man. That's just been fantastic. Do you have any other questions, or are we going to try to get more information out of Robert? Anything else he might know?
I have a couple more questions. So as far as, since both are UTXO based, if you build something on Ergo, you've seen the code for Cardano, smart contracts are not out yet, but what does that timeline look like when you're implementing a feature in Ergo? How long would it be to implement that same feature in Cardano? Is it like completely foreign different environments where it would take just a complete rebuild, or is it something that you just have to add a few lines of code and then press send?
So if by feature you mean like on the blockchain level itself,
yes,
they're entirely different projects. But if you're talking about on the smart contract level, so like the dApps and what you're building on top of the system, then they're both extended UTXO model. And so, because Ergo is written in Scala, it's proof of work. When you're changing the actual ledger implementation and changing features there, or like signing stuff, the code's entirely different. But on the smart contract level, for the extended UTXO model, they're using a very similar system with some differences in metadata and small stuff like that. So what does that actually mean in practical terms? When you write a smart contract, the code, one's in Plutus, which is Haskell-based, one's in Ergo script, which is Scala-based. The code itself isn't one-to-one when you create a project, say in Ergo script, and you want to move it to Plutus. However, the protocol designs, in most cases, can be replicated. And so you can think about this as if, you write a blueprint. Maybe I'm in, one country, you're in another country. Maybe some of the standards for how houses are designed are slightly different in my country compared to your country. But the blueprint itself will work no matter in which country you're in. And so you're going to have to fine tune the blueprint because, they won't allow you to build that specific kind of house because the regulations say you need this height and you have 2 inches less, yada, yada, yada. The same thing happens in the UTXO model for smart contracts. You can have the same high-level specification that explains how the protocol works. And if anyone's interested, I've written a informal specification for Oracle pools, so you can kind of see on a high level how these kinds of things are specified. And then we can use that specification eventually once Goguen releases, once Plutus releases, and all the tooling is ready. We can take that and write very similar contracts that do very similar things, but they're not one-to-one. So,
okay. I have two more questions, so I wanted to get these to you. So, first of all, is there anything else you can talk to us? Tell us about Plutus. Is there any other smart contract information that you'd like to share? Have you taken an in-depth look at Plutus in the past few months? What's the status? And yes, what's going on with that?
So I can't tell you specifics. I mean, first of all, I'm not an IOG, so I'm even further out than the Yoroi timeline. I'm not giving you any timelines. No one, treat this as anything I say as, the truth. But Plutus has made a lot of progress over the past few years. And it's been great to see that IOG is really putting in a lot of effort to get a lot of the tooling ready. And the approach they've taken attempts to make a whole development environment that is ready for developers to start building. You can say it's slightly different than the Ergo approach, where there was less tooling from the get-go on release. And so the tooling was built kind of over time. But with Plutus, they're taking more of build a really large foundation and allow people to work from that. Each approach has pluses, negatives. And in the case of Plutus, it's taken a little bit longer than some of us have expected, but they're building out a lot of cool stuff. And so I think this is an exciting time as Goguen is going to be released. We're going to start to get people actually testing this stuff out and seeing how the UTXO, extended UTXO system works on Ergo and proof of work. Now we're also going to get to experience what that is like on proof of stake and see the ups and the downs and how that all goes. And this is really exciting just to see this whole new era of smart contracts really start to take form. Okay.
And my last question was, I should have asked it when we were talking about Oracle pools. So we're going to switch back to Oracle pools. In your video on the EMURGO channel, you talked about 3 different tiers. So like tier 1 is just like a regular Oracle. I guess as you go up the tiers, it becomes a greater and greater pool. Is it the Oracle's decision which tier they can be part of? Or can they decide, I want to run more solo and be this kind of tier 1 Oracle that doesn't amalgamate into this giant pool? Or is it something like as the reputation increases, they move up a system and they have to be part of a pool, have to be part of a tier 3, if that makes any sense?
Right. So the answer to your question is kind of both. So as I mentioned, the whole idea of Oracle pools is to give people the tools so that they can do whatever they want. Maybe, if we're having a very private data point that's only relevant to us 3, we can have an Oracle pool that's just us 3. There's no, stacked hierarchy. That's 3, 4, 5 layers. And so it's not really relevant for us for our use case to have very, very high assurance data because we trust each other, but we just need some data on chain that we all use. But often we want higher assurance. And so as you mentioned, you can have an Oracle pool. So you have oracles at the first layer. The second layer is Oracle pools. So groupings of individual oracles together into a pool. And then you can have a hierarchy, which is a pool of Oracle pools. So an amalgamation of separate Oracle pools all coming together to create a new data point that is averaged out. The great thing about the UTXO model is that I or anyone has access to the data in every single UTXO on the blockchain. So if I want to be part of a hierarchy, I can talk with other people and set up a hierarchy. But also it's actually possible for other people to create a hierarchy out of data that I post, even if they don't talk to me. And so it's possible to kind of do both, where you can choose to say, just go into a hierarchy, get paid from top down, or others can just use your data points, which you produce. And so they'll pay you still. And so you still benefit as if it's just, a normal Oracle pool, but they can use you. And let's say I'm really interested in creating a 3-tier hierarchy, so a pool of Oracle pools. I can find 3 pools who all source the same data, and I myself can choose to use them by creating a smart contract that averages all 3 of them out. And so you have this flexibility of both being permissioned, but also permissionless. And so that flexibility is quite cool in my opinion. And I guess as a small caveat too, that's not written in the write-up or in the video, because it's something that's more a bit of something in the further future that's kind of interesting. The hierarchies, you could say, are 2D, where you're simply adding pools of pools of pools of pools, and that's how you increase up the hierarchy. And hopefully you increase assurance in that way. There's also other ideas of how you can increase the assurance of Oracle data by not just going 2D, but going 3D. And so by adding different layers of Oracle data assurance. And so, as I mentioned before, there's the ability to calculate the cost of corruption. And there's other mechanisms which use cost of corruption for assuring Oracle data. And this is in the far future, as I'm saying, but as a small little tidbit for people, maybe to get interested more into Oracle pools and to think of new UTXO-based dApps, you can actually layer your Oracle pools potentially with other protocols and have even greater assurance. And the UTXO model is really great for doing this kind of stuff.
Wow. Man, that's amazing stuff. I'm so glad to have you here, Robert. I'm always imagining things like, we have this, we talk about supply chain management, and now that you explain these oracles so well, I can imagine all the incredible possibilities where these Oracle sensors, the Oracle, what'd you call it? Not a sensor, but
connector?
Connector, yeah. Running in the supply chains where a lot of barcode scanning is used and databasing is used, and a connector could run in little software apps in the supply chain and report back to the Oracle pools and all that kind of cool stuff. So now it looks like things are coming to life. I don't know if that's the case, but I'd imagine it could be. What do you think, Philippe? We're at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
And sorry, the clock's up there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess we can wrap it up. No,
I didn't. Yeah, I didn't want to rush it along, but I was wondering, was there anything else that Robert wanted to tell us? Philippe, what were you going to ask? What were you going to say?
No, I was going to ask the exact same thing. Robert, thank you so much for joining us on the Cardano Effect podcast. You're one of my favorite guests that we've had on. I always feel like I learn so much when you're on, and your videos are awesome, and you just have a great way of presenting the information. So thank you. And do you have any last words, or for the viewers and listeners of the Cardano Effect, did you want to leave us with anything?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's always great to be here with you guys. And in regards to the viewers, I guess one of the things that I would like to convey is that right now we're right at the start of exploring into the extended UTXO model and smart contracts on Ergo, Cardano, and these whole kind of old school in terms of UTXO, like blockchain, but also novel technologies, because no one's really done anything here before. And what's really exciting about that is we don't know where everything's going to go. We know there's so much potential, and we're taking step by step by step. But there's so few of us right now, because everything is so new, that I already have 6-8 different directions that I would like to do more research into, but I literally just don't have the time. You have to choose a project, work on it, develop it, build it, and have something palpable for people. But there's just so much potential. And so for anyone who's technically competent, or maybe even someone who's interested in learning to do programming and really get into all of this, I would highly recommend that you put in the time and the effort. And especially now, as Goggen's going to come out, and now we're going to have 2 systems running live on mainnets with the extended UTXO model. This is the opportune time for people to start learning, to actually jump into this, because as it grows and escalates, there's almost only one direction for all this, upwards. And so now is a really good time to invest some of your own personal time and actually understand what's a UTXO, What's a spending path? How do all these things work? What's the data input, for example? And try to get a good understanding so that maybe even if you don't understand everything 100%, you can start to experiment, create your first smart contract, try something cool, and maybe with your friends, you can make some sort of a puzzle as in a smart contract and post it on chain, and your friend tries to figure out how to solve it. And you can try to get creative and start to understand the ins and outs so that in 1, 2, 3, 5 years, when all of the base infrastructure for the smart contract layer starts to be developed and ready for use on a massive scale, and as we go into DeFi and everything really grows and builds up in these ecosystems, you aren't, there wishing, 5 years ago, if only I read that tutorial and I started working on building smart contracts. There's no reason to wait until after everything grows, because then it'll be a little bit too late. Now's the perfect moment to get into all this. And admittedly, there's not tons and tons of material out there for people to jump in. You don't just have a textbook, extended UTXO model. That will be coming, in 1, 2, 3, 4 years. But maybe some of you are the people who are going to write that textbook. And so now is really the opportune moment to jump into all of this. Check out, Ergo, which you can Google Ergo platform. You can find links to everything, YouTube, the forum, Reddit, yada, yada, yada. Check out some of the Plutus stuff that's being built right now, which is a bit more in a very development stage. And so you have to read a lot of documentation, read some comments and code. And so if you're really interested, I'd recommend getting into Ergo right now, which will also prepare you a bit more for Plutus. Maybe getting some Haskell background if you want to do Plutus. That's also very helpful. And taking these steps and going forward step by step by step, learning how all this works, is just an investment that I think is very hard to imagine won't return in a multiplicative fashion.
Awesome.
Fantastic. You're inspiring.
Yes.
Thank you.
Inspiring, Robert.
Yeah.
Let's fire him up. We got to grow our own, man. We're going for number 1, bro.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for joining us. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. Until the next episode of The Cardano Effect. Bye, everyone.